we're recording. Excellent. So, Tony Alexander, probably most well known as Chief Economist of BNZ, former Chief Economist of BNZ from 2019, leading economist, and could say that over the years has written more on New Zealand economy than anyone else. Tony, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it doesn't mean I've written the most intelligent or insightful stuff on the New Zealand economy. It just means that when I came back to New Zealand after a couple of years in Sydney in 1987, I started up a daily summary of what was happening in the financial markets at Westpac back at the time, and then started writing weekly things. And I've been writing weekly publications pretty much ever since. So that's about 30 years of doing that. And I thought to myself, imagine if you put all of that into a stack, that's going to look like a lot more than anyone has written in terms of academic papers or anything. So it's purely a volume thing as opposed to necessarily the deep, insightful stuff you might get from people with some smaller smaller output.
The latest stuff you have been producing, I understand quite a lot of reports and almost interpretation of the information, that all the information out there, you're trying to put it in a simple format for people to be able to absorb, yeah?
Yeah, basically that's what I'm trying to do. Too often people are operating in a bit of a vacuum, so they're aware that there's an economy, a thing called the economy, that it's going to impact on them. The risk is that they may pick up on a sensationalized newspaper headline, such as, house prices going to collapse or something. And I guess the biggest example of this would have been in late 2008, when the global financial crisis was getting underway. House prices had fallen about 33% in the United States. And in October of 2008, some people were saying, we're going to see house prices collapse 40% in New Zealand. And I thought to myself, that's just absolutely ridiculous. So I jumped into the housing space, and I've remained there ever since with analysis and commentary, and said at the time, we don't have a big oversupply. Maybe the prices go down 10 to 15%, and that's it. And at its worst, they were down about 11% for a short period of time. So I'm just trying to I'm trying to drag people away from unrealistic views about what's going to happen, and give them something they can understand, I guess.
And Tony, to get to today's sort of hot topic, which is on everyone's minds, consciously and unconsciously, we've had a lot of negative news, from an economic depression to signs similar to the Great Depression to conspiracy theories, and people are overwhelmed with information in front of their computers. Let's discuss some realities and maybe positives that could be ahead of us. In particular, me being from property development, let's discuss some realities and what's ahead of us for property developers, investors, first home buyers.
Yep. Okay. First of all, let's just start with some of the early discussion that appeared here, that, it's going to be another Great Depression or this sort of thing. What I concentrated on trying to educate people about roughly 3 weeks ago was there are key elements here that are from the Great Depression, from the GFC, from our share market crash in 1987. And if I start with that one, back in 1987, our economy had been rigidly structured by the government. It was freed up, and we saw a massive reduction in manufacturing and the agricultural sector as subsidies were removed and fighting high inflation. That's not this. The GFC, the global financial crisis, was about the banking sector having done a lot of bad lending overseas and bad borrowing by people, overinvestment in housing. The world's banking sector has gone into this shock crisis in relative shape, completely different from the GFC. And the Great Depression, well, this is where it gets interesting, you see, because we are going to be seeing the unemployment rise quite significantly, measures of economic output fall away. But we're only talking a short period of time here, as opposed to the Great Depression, which was it took about 4 years in New Zealand. For many countries, it wasn't until World War II really got going that they pulled out of it. And the lesson from the Great Depression was, when you have a major downturn or even a mild downturn in your economy, don't turn it into a depression, which is what the authorities did back then. Yes. The United States Federal Reserve shrank their money supply 30%. They allowed half the banks to fail, and governments around the world cut back on their spending. The lesson ever since, when you have a slowdown, do the opposite. And the GFC was that in spades. This is somewhat different in that we do have good government sort of stimulatory measures going on. The key characteristic about this downturn which makes absolutely unique in global economic history, is that governments have moved beyond just we might boost our spending and central banks cutting interest rates to trying to stop the second round effects of a slowdown. So when you get a slowdown in the economy, people get laid off. Government tries to limit layoffs by giving the wage subsidy for up to 12 weeks, for instance, to help businesses carry through as many employees as possible to the other side. In a downturn, people lose their incomes, they get evicted from their houses. The governments look to stop that particular process with 60 days, the landlord can throw you out. We see in previous downturns that banks will logically, stop lending. They're worried if they'll ever get the money back. So the government's put in place the business guarantee scheme there of $6.5 billion to try and get as many businesses viable, liquidity-wise, cash flow-wise, through to the other side. So all of these measures are aimed at stopping or not. Well, the virus outbreak numbers so far in New Zealand are suggesting we will come out of lockdown in a reasonable period of time. And then our economy, which obviously is shrinking with most of us being at home at the moment, it will initially, this is where it's going to get interesting. When we get out of lockdown, there's going to be a lot of stuff we don't catch on. Some people, they might normally be spending $1,000, $1,500 a month in cafes, bars, restaurants, nightclubs. Well, after a month, I've got that money saved up. So some of them are going to go out and spend it. The wise first home buyer will hopefully recognize, I just imagine I did that for 6 months. I'm building up a far better house deposit is one angle. I was talking with some people in a valuation company earlier on today, and they're noting that when the lockdown ends, they're going to be exceedingly busy catching up on property valuations. So you're going to get a surge in activity when you're free to rotate, but the after effects continue throughout the entirety of this year. So the initial rebound through to maybe the end of this year into early 2021. And the unemployment rate probably going to keep rising through to the latter of 2021 and maybe into 2022, because it's got a cycle which is slightly different from the overall economy there. In terms of what it means, I guess, for the housing market, in terms of things coming through here, if we take a look at prices, in that initially some people were saying, look, there's going to be some big falls in house prices. And I think it's fairly obvious if you're having a lot of people made unemployed, houses is going to go down. And so I would expect around the country, we will see some downward movement in average house prices. But the variation from one place, one market to another is going, I think, to be quite large. So why don't I start maybe at where it's going to be worse. And first, I would suspect it's going to be down Queenstown, Wanaka. It's an international tourism hotspot and a domestic tourism hotspot. We now have no international tourism in New Zealand, and it really isn't going to come back until maybe the second half of 2021 and relatively slowly. Now, there's a lot of people, obviously their businesses are dependent upon it down there. Some now their houses. You've got a lot of working in the tourism hospitality sector down that way. Jobs no longer there. They'll be coming back to wherever they came. 200,000 people in New Zealand on temporary work visas. And although they have a visa extension to September, once that period ends and the international flights are starting to get more available, I think most of these people are going to leave New Zealand. They're going to leave from your Queenstown, Wanaka area. It's an aspirational purchase area, and one thing that always happens when the business sector has been in New Zealand, we stop buying our motorboats, we stop buying the holiday homes, we don't develop the section we were going to build a nice house on, Wanaka, etc. So you always get that happening. So Queenstown, Wanaka, I think you're looking at some decent declines in prices. I won't guess how much. It won't be apocalyptic. The locals probably won't bother too much about it, but it will eventually be visible. Next on the rank might be maybe Rotorua and some other places, but the interesting thing there is that most of us can drive to Rotorua. Over 75% of New Zealand's population is in the North Island. And as we travel domestically, internationally ourselves, for the next year, and we were spending about $10 billion overseas, us Kiwis, per annum. Many of us, I think, are going to go to Rotorua. So I think things are going to ease off definitely there, but not as bad as down Queenstown, etc. Third, I might put in the regions generally in New Zealand. Now, I don't have a whole view on the regions. It's doing okay. It's prizes. A lot of investors in the past 3 years have moved out of Auckland, stopped purchasing there, and they've gone to the regions looking for some quick capital gains, and they've done exceedingly well out of it. Each cycle, this is only ever a temporary thing. Eventually, investors, and that's what they're going to be doing now, going back and looking for purchasing opportunities in the cities. In addition, when your economy goes into recession around the world, generally, apart from maybe places like India and China, people move to the big cities looking for work. So some population will shift from the regions into cities. For the cities themselves, Auckland, what do we look? Tauranga, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, and Dunedin, I expect prices will decline, but I think the measure is going to be relatively limited. Auckland, overall, the average price is about 4.5%. No one really got excited about it. It was neither here nor there. I think we're looking at maybe something similar for the major cities overall, except I could have put this location down towards the Queenstown, Wanaka area, and that would be the Auckland inner city apartment market. Airbnb. It houses a lot of the foreign students in New Zealand. They're either not there or they're here, but they're going to be leaving over the remainder of this year and not coming back for a long period of time. It's a large sector in Auckland and often staffed by people on working visas. They'll be leaving as well. So maybe if I'll just finish up this little section here just by noting, for first home buyers, they're a little bit depressed about their KiwiSaver balances. Most of them have never seen a recession. They are definitely the biggest group pulling back from the property market at the moment. But my invitation to them would be, A, lockdown, they can quickly offset your temporary KiwiSaver losses, and B, maybe just keep an eye on the Auckland inner city apartment market there, because maybe later on this year into 2021, there could be some good purchasing opportunities where you get some cheaper than now and get your foot on the ladder. Just a thought for further down the track.
If we a little bit, you've touched on a little bit in Queenstown and stuff, but let's assuming that tourism is going to be very slow to recover, and we could perhaps say it may take 3 to 5 years to get back to anywhere close to where it was. Not sure if it will. Yeah, migration could be at a low level for some time. What do you think the population growth of New Zealand could be? Because that's what's really been driving the demand for property and the lack of property.
Yeah, okay, I'm just noting 2 things here. Number one, population growth, because there we're talking about the rise in demand for property, but I want to also talk about supply, new construction of houses. You see, in economics, it's the interaction of demand and supply that determines your average prices and how they change going forward. Now, the migration one is interesting. New Zealand has, we enjoyed a net migration gain of about 45,000 last year. It's about a 0.9% boost to our population. The gains over the past 5 years are about 240,000 extra. Something like that. It's a 5% boost to our population, so obviously fairly significant, and it has greatly benefited the cities in particular. Migrants go where the jobs are. Migrants go where migrants have gone. And so we're largely talking about the cities there. Now, while we're in lockdown, the flows really can't operate. The people aren't coming in, the people aren't going out. So let's sort of forget about that period for the moment. It's going to take a while for the international flights to get going again. The foreigners are not going to be migrating to New Zealand until we open our borders. I don't think we're opening our borders to foreigners until the planet is vaccinated. New Zealand has a good chance of being virus-free while the virus is still being worked on in most other parts of the world. And even if we're talking about most of Asia and the Western world becoming relatively clear of the virus in 6 or 9 months' time, I don't know, just think about Africa, Latin America, some of the poorer parts of the world where it's likely to remain endemic for a long period of time until the billions of vaccine doses are developed. Assuming So what you're looking at there is that, yeah, the migration numbers are likely to be relatively weak, you'd think, going forward for maybe a couple of years. But there's 1 million Kiwis overseas. There's about 650,000 in Australia, plus their partners, plus their children, and all the rest in other parts of the world. And I think in a few weeks' time, people are going to be looking at New Zealand, where hopefully we are virus-free, and thinking to themselves, maybe I would rather be there with all the weakness and continuing problems on getting the virus under control and social distancing, etc. overseas. I can't help but think that over not so much the very short term, but the medium to long term, we're going to get an increased number of Kiwis coming back to New Zealand and foreigners going, look, that's the place I would like to be. Especially if we start, each of us, to buy into the theory that maybe as we've all been locked down for about 4 weeks here, we're reevaluating our personal lives. That maybe we're going to be so just emphasising the family, etc., a heck of a lot more. And so I can't help but think we're going to get a population boost long term. Short term, you look towards. And over the long term, I think the migration numbers remain pretty strongly in New Zealand's favour. If you're looking, I guess, at the supply side coming forward, this is where it gets interesting. Each of us, we can look at a thing happening and say, I know what that means for the demand for New Zealand products overseas, or we can see it changing. I think it means the price goes up. But it's hard to pick the supply response, especially agricultural, commodity production overseas. Now, at the moment, while we're in lockdown, no new houses are getting built. I mean, that's it, end of story. When we come out, some projects are still going to be on hold for a while because they rely upon materials coming in from either China or other parts of the world where their factories are now closed down. China's factories are back up and running, but not the rest of the world. So in the manufacturing and construction sectors, for the rest of this year, their production has impeded the volume growth by not having, I don't know, enough copper wiring, the light fittings, or the desired plumbing fittings. That's going to be an interruption to supply growth. That's only part of the issue, however, when we're talking about supply coming forward. The big issue for the property development sector is the ability of property finance. It's become relatively tough in the past. We saw, I guess what I've been saying to people is that we've had a banking super cycle in New Zealand from 1984 through to 2008, when credit was readily available, and since then it's tightened up quite a bit. We saw that actually the first tightening after the share market crash and property market crash, commercial property, of late 1987, pulled back from a lot of their financing of commercial property activities, industrial in particular, back then. But the finance companies took up the slack from 1992, 1995 onward. And then with the global financial crisis, we saw a further structural tightening up on the finance of the commercial residential property subdivision development, GFC. Now we're probably going to face a new slight tightening going on. We saw 3 years ago the banks tighten up their lending, mainly in the commercial development sector, because they were having, I guess, increased reliance on funding from overseas, so they just need to pull back on some of their lending growth. And most of us have been saying for the past year that as the banks over the 7 years now have to start increasing their capital bases, they will pull back more and more from the riskier end of the lending spectrum. That's not really the housing side. It is more maybe the commercial property development side. We're going to see the banks pulling away from that, and that's going to restrict the supply going forward there. But also some of the property developments, and I guess this is where we get to trying to get down to the real nitty gritty of what does it mean for the property sector out of what we see happening at the moment. Banks are just flat out at the moment processing applications for mortgage deferrals, for business finance, assistance, and they're going to remain that way for pretty much all of this year, we may assume. Their resource ability, the staffing ability to adequately assess and process new loan applications is going to be really limited all of this year. But as the staff resources become available, I think the banks once again are going to pull back a bit further from general financing of property in particular. They need to rebuild their capital bases. They're going to look to reduce their risk profiles over a period of time. And I guess the interesting thing is this. In Auckland in particular, maybe, we've seen the change to the unitary plan a few years ago, maybe and able to be subdivided. So a lot of it has been. It's been carved up, and a lot of smaller operators will have been, getting into the market out there. Those that don't have good finance in place, a good relationship with their bank, some of them might even find that they're not able to complete their projects because the system them will be able to go to the non-bank lending sector. That sector's been growing very well over the past few years. Some of the Aussie operators are just pulling back to Australia at the moment, but definitely the New Zealand ones there, they'll, I think, have some capacity going forward. But it's going to be interesting in the residential property development sector over the next few years, because finance availability will be a bit more constrained than in the past, and some will have to find some additional finance sources in the next 12 months because the banks might have reached some sort of limit on the risk that they're looking to take, for instance.
What about, Tony, what about quantitative easing? And do you believe it will help the economy in the long term?
Yeah, quantitative easing, money printing, we used to always think, oh, this is going to cause hyperinflation, because it did in Germany between the two world wars, for instance, Zimbabwe recently, Venezuela, another example. The evidence from after the global financial crisis is that money printing has exactly the opposite effect by, and I'll explain how it works in a moment, by having a lot of extra money sloshing around the money systems, the banking systems around the world, by keeping it low, it's meant that a lot of businesses who would otherwise have had to close down because the money wasn't available to lend to them, to keep financing them, or the interest rates would have been too high in normal times, they have remained in business. They have kept producing widgets. And the oversupply of widgets, manufactured goods, have created the GFC greater worries about deflation, falling prices, than inflation. And this is the complete opposite of everything we've learned at university for decades now. And that is maybe the risk of what's happening going forward. If somebody out there is sort of listening to this at the moment and thinking, hang on, if they're talking about money printing, doesn't that mean we're going to get inflation in the countries in the near future? No, I think the opposite is likely. You're going to get downward pressure on prices because there's going to be still a lot of stuff sloshing around the planet. How does quantitative easing work? Because most people still don't understand this one. It's not a physical churning of the printing press. It used to be back in the old days, not nowadays. The way it works is this. The government is running a big deficit. They're injecting extra money into the economy to help in a downturn. They're running a deficit. The Great Depression taught us that is what you most definitely do. So it's good. Well, the government, Treasury, will look to issue government bonds. So if the government runs a deficit of $10 billion, you've got to issue $10 billion worth of bonds. And that takes the $10 billion the government spent on paying the dole, work projects or whatever, it takes it back out of the economy again, keeps things in balance. Well, the way it works is with money printing is this. Say I'm an investor and I've got $100,000 sitting in my bank account. It's just sitting there. And I'm thinking, I'm going to buy $100,000 worth of government bonds. So I'm just about to go and buy the $100,000 worth of government bonds to finance their deficit, and the bank buys them first. I go, oh, bugger, you bought what I was just going to do. Now I'm left with $100,000 in my bank account I didn't think was going to be there tomorrow. That's the money printing. It's my money as an investor, which is still sitting in my bank account, which was going to leave the system to finance the government's overspending. The Reserve Bank and Treasury, they just each other, as it were, and the money printing is my money. And so I think, oh, what will I do with this? I guess I'll put it, leave it on a deposit, low interest rate. Maybe I'll go and buy some gold, or maybe I'll go and invest in some property. I'll invest in something that's going to give me some yield. And this is one reason why money printing after the GFC caused such strong increases in both property prices, equity prices. Money was looking for a home, and some of it found its way into the share markets around the world and into the property market. And I can't help but thinking that we're going to see a similar thing happen this time around. And maybe that's why in the share market in particular, although the Dow Jones index at its worst into the crisis so far fell about 37%, when I looked just not too long ago, about 3% from its previous high of about, whatever the number was, 29,500, I think, on the Dow Jones. People are anticipating this money is going to end up, the printing around the world, back in share markets, back in property markets. And so that's another key reason I haven't previously listed much about why I think the decline in property prices, A, will be limited, B, if it happens, is likely to be reversed over time, and the longer term property investor, property developer, etc., I think we'll keep an eye on that positive fundamental.
You touched on it before in terms of potentially some New Zealanders that are overseas coming to New Zealand, but maybe you could highlight in a few sentences what advantage do you think we have in comparison to the rest of the world?
Okay, most definitely not income. I made quite a few trips over 10 or so years ago. I used to talk to lots of groups of Kiwis, especially across in London, New Zealand House, and a few other places over there. Did the same thing in Singapore and Hong Kong as well. Talked to groups in Hamburg and Paris. And lots of people, the Kiwis over there, would express an interest in coming back to New Zealand, but every single one of them was fully aware that they wouldn't be coming back for money purposes. They could easily make a lot more money, whether it be on a salary or most probably in a business, where they were overseas. But people were looking to come back to New Zealand for the lifestyle, for the reduced, commuting, the reduced pollution, the better access to the outdoors, homeland, I suppose, and the great feeling there. Basically, looking to bring up their family in a different environment from what they're exposed to, especially across in the likes of London. For New Zealand versus Australia, not quite such a strong dynamic there on coming back to New Zealand from Australia. But as I indicated earlier, I can't help thinking that Australia, because it's not going for complete erasure of the virus in New Zealand, that for the remainder of this year, and I guess until a vaccine is along, they're going to have social distancing rules, etc., and outbreaks of a completely different nature from what will have in New Zealand. That and the weakening of the Australian economy is likely to see, I think, a number of Kiwis look to come back to New Zealand. So from my point of view, again, on the migration side, for the coming year, it's going to be a well below average net migration inflow into New Zealand. But for me, if I were an investor, it's the long term that I'll be looking at. And I think over the long term, we're going to regain the Kiwis from overseas, but also many of us not leaving, because there's two big flows. We Kiwis leave, we come back. Many of us, we're going to stay we'll rather than go overseas.
And what areas do you see investment opportunities for both people starting out now, or some will be restarting their business because others have fallen over, or potentially investors? So these are the areas where you see good potential, basically in the new reality.
Yeah, this is interesting because, as an economist, I want to talk about this sector is going to grow. So maybe it's that sector you look to get an early exposure to and you watch it grow. But that's not necessarily the rule when you are looking at a major downturn like this. If I were an entrepreneur, a pure capitalist, and I'm looking for some long-term investment opportunities, or even some short-term maybe investment opportunities, you actually don't look necessarily for the best sectors, you look for the worst. You look for the ones where a lot of operators have gone in undercapitalized, maybe inexperienced, and they're going to get burnt off. And it's the way it goes. It's unfortunate for them and maybe the people that are back there. That's where the opportunities will tend to crop up. So much as every bone in my body is aching to say, well, you don't want to go anywhere near the tourism sector. Well, actually, you would expect a lot of cheap assets are going to come on the market over the next 6, 12, 18 months from operators who simply cannot get their way through. They haven't been able to source the finance, the cash flow finance in particular, beyond the next 6 months. So the comment I make there basically is whatever sector in the economy you see under some stress, as a capitalistic, entrepreneur person, that is probably where you are looking if you've got the capital behind you, your own, the people that you work with, etc., to make some good purchases. And as I indicated early on, maybe it's not necessarily just the things that are already sitting there in place in operation in whatever sector. When you're talking about the property development sector, and I've seen this over the cycles, that somebody simply cannot get enough money together, new capital or finishing money from the bank to finish their project. If they get something, it sits there unfinished for years. And we've seen this sort of thing often in Pacific Islands. Somebody's got great ideas. They start making the villas. They sit there as concrete structures for the next 20 years. They couldn't get the final financing together to make it viable. So that's also where I would be looking. There are going to be many people out there who are willing to give good equity percentage ownership of a project for maybe a relatively small contribution, because all they need is that extra, I don't know, $250,000, $1 million to make sure the project can be finished, but you're the only one that's got it maybe. So I would look for those opportunities going through there. My view on the continued strong population growth, especially in the cities, means that I would be keeping an eye out for maybe some temporarily distressed people looking to move on from maybe some land that they hold in the major cities, for instance. Or indeed, projects got some people out there who own properties, investors, but the rents, they're having to discount them at the moment. Some of them might have taken on a lot of debt in order to get those properties. And so there might be some opportunities that come along there. But overall, there's, I guess, the opportunities that appear in the next 3, 6, 9, 12, maybe out to 18 months, I think will be gone well beyond then. So there's opportunities, but then there is more of the long-term growth focus. Where do the opportunities for growth exist in New Zealand over the longer term? And I suppose for there, we're looking at things like the farming sector. They love our food. They want our food. Their citizens are concerned about, food security. And so I would expect to see some more capital of very long-term nature for the farming sector as well, farming equipment or whatever. Medical technology, that's sort of a no-brainer. Whatever country you and I would be in at the moment talking about this, would say, oh, medical technology, making of some medical equipment. So a bit of a no-brainer, I think, on that one. And the tourism, it will come back. And so for the long term, I would certainly be quite happy having a tourism exposure, whether it's domestic or international, but I'd be pretty cautious on my revenue projections for the next 18 months in that sector.
Thank you, Tony. And last question before we say goodbye to everyone. If you could shortly describe what the world would look like after all this is finished.
I think it'll be a better place where we will have experience of what it looks like not to have the skies polluted by all the vehicle exhaust, rivers clean, the early pictures of the canals in Venice, for instance. We will have insight into what our environment might look like if we could actually change our lifestyles, and we're a bit more concerned about climate change in particular. So I think we're probably looking at an environment, economy, society in the future, which is going to be more environmentally sustainable. So I think that's a positive thing. I think we're going to have a bit more of a return to a focus on family out of all of this, because that, I guess, is what's most important to people at the end of the day. A big one when we're talking about the property sector is many people are discovering that they can do their work from home. And I think you're going to get quite a decrease in demand for CBD, commercial office space, which may catch some investors, some owners out in that regard, but that might produce some opportunities for smaller clusters in the suburbs, in the region, people to be having their meetups there once a week or a fortnight, etc., for their staff. So these are very early days of picking what the world is going to look like after this. And we've got to remember, out of SARS in China, that's where e-commerce took a boom. It could be the telecommuting thing that takes a boom, I guess, over the long term out of this one.
Very good. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tony, for making the time and sharing a wealth of information with us.
Okay, thanks very much, Grigori.